filmmaker
Yes.
who's on board of the Holocaust Museum. She's coming back to Lynn for me in January.
Okay.
We might do it both as an in-person and a Zoom event. So he can always, Zoom on to see what she has.
Okay.
Yeah. Just let me know.
Fabulous. But I will reach out to you about the screenwriter. He's working on a movie now. Actually, you would love it. It's a true story of what happened at UCF. I'll tell you about it because it's really interesting.
Yeah.
As someone who's a professor, it's a disturbing thing that happened. So, all
geez.
right, we're going to be quiet so Amanda can let people in, and I'll start and then I'll drop off.
Have a good day.
Okay. Amanda, you can let everyone in and we can start.
Okay.
And you're recording?
Yep. It's
Great.
yep. No problem.
Good afternoon and welcome to the third of what will be 4 weeks with Dr. Robert Watson, visiting topics related to Holocaust, anti-Semitism, and American history. You notice that there are 5 Tuesdays in the month of November, but only 4 weeks with Dr. Watson. That's because we take a week off for next week for Thanksgiving. We hope everyone has a very, very happy Thanksgiving. There will be no lunch and learn next Tuesday, and we will resume the final week of November on November 30th. The 30 days has November. Yeah, I think it's the last day of November as well. So our last session with Dr. Watson. So come back in 2 weeks from today. This is perhaps my favorite lecture of his. The story of the birth of the state of Israel is just unbelievable. And the way Dr. Watson tells the story is incredible. And I just want to thank our producer, Amanda Brentsell. I'm at a staff retreat, so I'll be dropping off, but virtual Bethel, otherwise known as our amazing Amanda Brentsell, will monitor the chat. If you have any questions, just drop them there or any problems with anything. So Dr. Watson, with no further ado, I hand things over to you.
Thanks, Rabbi Jessica. It's always a pleasure. I have the great honor of calling Rabbi Jessica a friend. And I know a lot of you. I was clicking around, looking at some of the photos. Good-looking crowd, and I recognize so many of you. So I can't wait to get back to in person to these events. But yeah, it's been a pleasure. So this is week 3 in this 4-part series, number 3. And Amanda, thank you for your help with the tech. So as always, everybody, my favorite part of these programs is the Q&A. So have at me during the Q&A. And as Rabbi Jessica said earlier, there's no lecture next week because of Thanksgiving, but then the week after we're on. So let's move into this. So today is the story of statehood in 1948, May 14th, 1948. And Truman recognized the new state of Israel at right away that day, becoming the first leader in the world to do so. And this is the story of the behind the scenes aspects of it. So earlier in my career, I had the pleasure of interviewing a number of former advisors to Truman, Eisenhower, FDR, but I interviewed a lot of the Truman aides. And what I did with them was several of them were involved in this. So I conducted a number of intensive interviews over several years to try to get the behind the scenes story on this. I also met with and interviewed a handful of Israeli officials who were there for statehood, who shared their stories. So that's what we're going to talk about. So let's begin with my buddy, Kyrie Truman. There on the left is one of the earliest photos of Truman, born in rural Missouri, 1884. The last president to lack a college degree, everybody. He was not formally educated. Yet he was a voracious reader, a real bibliophile. That sort of forged his upbringing. I'll give you 2 fun stories and examples about what a voracious reader this guy was. One of his aides told me that he was once sent to visit with Truman about a half an hour to an hour before Truman was scheduled to give a major radio address. So the aide was a speechwriter. And he said his job was to have Truman read through the address one more time, just to fine tune it, to make sure he doesn't stumble through it. And the aide walked in and he said, usually when you walked into Harry Truman's office, it was a big warm hello. He knew your name. He said this time his head was in a book and he was all distracted. So the aide waited, and finally Truman closed the book. And the aide said, well, Mr. President, I'm here because you're supposed to read through your speech and practice it. And Truman said, no, I don't want to do that. He said, that's just a speech. Then he held up this huge, thick book and he said, now this is history. And he told the aide that in history, there's leadership lessons. Truman was reading a book on Charlemagne. And he proceeded to tell the aide sort of an overview of European history from a Charlemagnean perspective. Truman's grandson, Clifton, who's a good friend of mine, he and I have served on the Truman Foundation board for many years together. I bring him down here to Palm Beach County every winter to give some talks. He told me a fun story when he was younger. Harry and Bess, when they were retired, came to visit Clifton, his three brothers, and his mother at their New York City home. And he said, we loved when Grandpa visited because Harry was just Harry. But we also, the kids hated when he visited because he was so tough. So Clifton said Truman would never let the boys watch cartoons. He thought television and cartoons was a waste. So the boys said early Saturday morning, Truman always rose. He was up by 5:30 in the morning, 5:30, as he always said, military time. And the boys, they snuck down the steps quietly because Truman's sitting in a chair holding up the New York Times and he's behind the newspaper reading it early in the morning. The boys snuck down. They wanted to sneak past Grandpa, go to the other room and watch cartoons quietly. They said they tiptoed about halfway across the floor, and from behind the newspaper, they heard Grandpa Truman say, you don't want to do that. That's a waste. He said, now come over here and sit with me. I have a book to read for you. So the boys said, they were stuck sitting with Grandpa Harry reading a book. They said, fortunately, about 5 minutes later, Margaret comes down the steps in her bathrobe yelling at her father, you let those boys alone, let them watch cartoons. Truman was reading, guess what he was reading to the boys who were about 5 and 7? He's reading Thucydides, the history of the Peloponnesian War. My goodness. So even though Truman was the last president to lack a college degree, grew up in rural Missouri, was a failed haberdasher, a failed farmer, failed oil speculator, his upbringing was very much tempered by literature. He also loved the Old Testament, even though he was not religious at all. He loved the sweeping stories, the epics, the tales of David, Daniel, Moses, Noah. So he grew up reading all that good stuff, that heavy stuff. Truman had a couple goals when he was a young man. He wanted to be a military officer. He wanted to go to West Point, as you can see from the picture there to the right. That's Captain Harry in World War I. He was the captain of the Missouri Artillery, Battery D. So Truman wanted to go to West Point. Of course, unfortunately for him, he had no contacts. His family was poor. He wasn't going to West Point. He always wanted to be a military officer. He would get his chance in World War I, as I just said, where he served with great heroism and valor, by the way. He killed men, saw men die, was very tempered by the war. Truman's only concern in being a military officer was this: he couldn't see. Truman needed glasses from the time he was little and was blind as a bat. He said when he went to World War I, he put an extra pair of glasses in every pocket and rucksack in case if something happened to one of them. So the problem, of course, is you have to pass an eye test, right? Now, fortunately, even unfortunately for Harry, he couldn't see. Fortunately for Harry, he had a photographic memory, which I often talk about, those of you that suffer through all my lectures. So Truman is walking in to take his eye test, and he's really nervous because he'll never pass an eye test. There were two other younger men there, so he told the two, you go first. And he stood outside the door and he memorized the eye chart and listening to him say it, the two boys say it. So when he walked in, he said he couldn't even see the eye chart on the wall. He said, and the doctor said, okay, read the eye chart. And he said he read it all from memory. So the other thing Truman wanted to do was he always wanted to be an architect or an historian, which means he must be cool, right? So he always wanted to be an architect or an historian. None of that was going to happen either because he couldn't go to school. He would have a chance to do both, however. That was when the White House had to be gutted and completely renovated during his presidency. And Truman plays a role in the refurbishment and redesign of the building. So he gets to be an architect and an historian. And he was very keen on preserving the great historical integrity of the building. Thank goodness Truman was the president when we redid the White House. Could you imagine what some other presidents might have done to that building? Truman made sure it harkened back. He wanted it to look like it did in 1820. That's when it was redone after the British burned the building and city on August 24th, 1814. And under James Monroe's presidency, it was redone to embrace that French Empire, the inspiration when James Hoban, Pierre Charles L'Enfant, and other architects first designed the city and the building. So Truman had the idea. He was the one behind pushing for it to be renovated because he used to say the White House was haunted. He said the chandelier would swing on the ceiling when people would walk by. He would say that if the building would creak and groan, he would always say it was the ghost of old Andy Jackson walking the halls at night. He said some of the doors, when he tried to shut them, the doors didn't shut tight because the building was off kilter. They had added a third floor. You had old wooden beams. The building had caught fire twice. So Truman wanted to renovate the building. The problem is Congress wouldn't support him on it. He used to always say, he said, what's going to happen is this building is going to collapse and the Republicans will blame me. So what he did is he invited congressional leaders, the architect of the Capitol. He invited them all to come to the White House and show them how the doors didn't shut tight. It creaked, it groaned, the chandeliers, swayed. And in one of the cases of the most perfect timing in history and dumb luck, as they're walking across the floor, get this, there's a pile of rubble on the floor, concrete, rubble, as if it's a construction site. And everybody looks and they're thinking, what on earth is that? Get this, they look up and the leg of Truman's piano is sticking through the ceiling. And Truman gives this great line. He says, this building is standing purely by habit. So he got the funding to renovate the building. So that's young Harry Truman. The other thing about his childhood was he was a Shabbos Goy. He knew the Jewish community in the Independence and Kansas City area by his work as a young boy. So let's fast forward here. Boom. Okay. So 1948, Truman's running for president. He's longing to get elected for his own term. He was picked by FDR in 1944 to be FDR's third choice for vice president. And now he's running in 48. He's opposed on his political left and his political right within his own party. Henry Wallace, the former vice president, on his political left, and Strom Thurmond, the former Democrat turned Dixiecrat, and then turned Republican, the KKK racist governor and senator from South Carolina, or South Carolina, as he used to call his state. So I once met him and interviewed him, and I couldn't understand a damn word the guy said. It was like, roar, roar. It sounded like a foghorn leghorn meets Yosemite Sam. I couldn't understand anything the guy said. I just sat there shaking my head. At any rate, Thurmond opposes Truman on his political right. Now, at the 1940, apropos to statehood for Israel, in the 1948 Democratic Convention, they announced Truman's platform. And when they announced this platform, it included an aggressive civil rights program. Truman wanted a Civil Rights Act, get this, after the Second World War. That would have to wait until 1964. When Lyndon Johnson signed the bill that Kennedy had started. Truman also wanted statehood for Israel and a massive loan guarantee for the fledgling Jewish state. A $100 million loan guarantee. Could you imagine that in 1948, $100 million? That's real money. Also, when the country was broke after the war, and also because the country was so darn anti-Semitic, but he still wanted a massive $100 million loan guarantee. So in 1948, at the convention, When Truman's platform is announced, Strom Thurmond gets up and walks out of the convention in protest, taking Southern delegates and Dixiecrat delegates out of the building with him. When he's walking out, a reporter stops and says, "Why are you walking out?" And his answer is because of these two issues: civil rights and statehood for Israel. And also Truman wanted massive Jewish immigration from the displaced persons camps. So Thurmond complained about his civil rights plan and his Israel plan, and he used disparaging language. And the reporter says to Thurmond, but Truman's platform simply says what FDR's platform always said. And Thurmond says, yeah, but here's the difference. We all knew that FDR would only ever talk about that. That son of a bitch Truman means it. And he walked out. That night, Truman realizes he won't even win the nomination, much less the presidency. There's a dissent on the floor over civil rights and a Zionist program. And Truman puts pen to paper and puts his frustrations on paper, and he writes the following. He says, quote unquote, he writes, in doing these, he means that those two issues, statehood and all the attending issues, the loan guarantee, immigration, and a civil rights package. Truman says, quote unquote, in doing these, I will lose the White House. So be it. It's the right thing to do. How about that, everybody? Do you hear that? Truman would rather do what's right and lose than do what's wrong and win. And I'm quite certain that's the last time any politician has ever said that. Just a remarkable, well, of course, Thurmond walked out, he leaves the party, he challenges Truman, he starts his own party, then eventually becomes a Republican, and Truman goes on to win. The other opposition Truman had to statehood for Israel in 1948 was from this man. This is the man Truman called the Great One, General George Marshall. Many senior political advisors and generals considered Marshall to be the veritable reincarnation of George Washington himself. Marshall was Truman's Secretary of State. He always said Truman said he's the greatest living American. Marshall opposes statehood. Get this, everyone. Marshall threatens to resign publicly and vote against Truman in 48 if Truman recognizes Israel as a state. Now, I'm happy to tell you that Marshall was not an anti-Semite. That's not why he was doing it. The reason Marshall did this was he said to Truman, what's going to happen is we are going to recognize Israel. We're going to offer them support. The Soviets will arm and back all the Arab states. They will declare war. They will drive the Jews into the sea, and we will have World War III on our hands and not get a drop of oil. Now, that was a distinct possibility. And Marshall wasn't the only senior general to say those things to Truman. Fortunately, Truman told Marshall, I refuse to accept your resignation, and I'm going to move ahead with statehood and all the other programs I have designed, and I want you to support me, and I want you to support Israel. And happily, that's what ended up happening. Marshall, his threat was not the only one Truman received. A number of advisors threatened to resign and quit over this issue. So on May 14th, 1948, at 6:11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Truman signs the proclamation. There it is, everybody. There's the proclamation. Now, Truman was upset at the State Department. When they drafted this, they used a very bureaucratic language. The United States recognizes the provisional government as the de facto authority in the Jewish state. That's about as uninspiring and about as bureaucratic as you can get. So Truman crosses that out, and look what he writes: State of Israel, okay? And at the bottom, in bold writing, he writes approved, and he puts the date and signs it across it. So I think you can read into that and get a sense of Truman's commitment for statehood and his support. The picture on the right, of course, in New York City and in Israel and around the world, the Jewish community was celebrating, rightly so. And the great Dr. Chaim Weizmann, who Truman becomes friends with, and Weizmann and Truman worked together on this. Weizmann would later write Truman a letter about statehood, thanking him, where he told a heck of a story. What he said was this: He said that, and I like the picture on the right. It reminds me of what Weizmann was writing about. When statehood was proclaimed and Truman supported it, there was pandemonium in the streets. A group of aides come running in to meet with Weizmann. And they said, there were two aides, and they said, Dr. Weizmann, haven't you heard? Statehood's been supported by Truman, it's official. And Weizmann was in his office writing letters. And Weizmann says, yes, I know. And they said, well, why aren't you celebrating? He says two things. Number one, he says, now the real work begins. We have to make the world recognize us and like us. So he was sitting there writing letters to world leaders to start the diplomatic overture. He said, secondly, he said, I'm not celebrating because, he said, I knew this would happen. And they said, how could you know? And he said, because when I talked to Truman, he gave me his word. How about that, everyone? When a president's word, a handshake, is a bond in cement, a bond of honor. So that's a story that comes to us from the great Dr. Weizmann. Truman does a number of things, not just recognize statehood, but displaced persons, the DPs. The most immediate problem for Truman is as soon as the war ends in Europe, that end of the first week in May of 1945, you have hundreds of thousands of Jews who survived the concentration camps in the war, who are now being moved to displaced persons camps. And some of these camps, as you see on the lower left, were just atrocious. Many people lack warm clothing. They lack medicine. They lack blankets. We were so short on facilities. Plus, the Americans, the Allies, have to immediately pivot and look at the Pacific theater and the island hopping campaign to Japan, and of course, dropping the bomb and ending the darn war in the Pacific campaign. So because we were so short of guards, so short of facilities, that the decision was made that some Jews who survived the camps would be in DP camps. They would use the concentration camp itself as a DP camp. Some folks were still wearing the striped uniforms, still in camps. We were so short on soldiers and guards that the decision was made that some of the guards in the DP camps would be former German soldiers. Can you imagine this? This is unbelievable. Who made these decisions? The man nominally in charge of security at the DP camps in Europe was General George Patton, who was an anti-Semite. I'm going to quick move forward here. There's Patton. Here's a quote from Patton. This is right before his untimely death in a car accident. I know Bill O'Reilly wrote a book and he claimed all these conspiracies and claimed firsthand. He made it all up. It's not footnoted. It's not refereed. It's not academic. It's a novel which he's trying to pass off as history. Same with all the killing this and killing Jesus and killing that. They're not historical. David McCullough, Doris Kearns Goodwin, Ron Chernow, John Meekum. No one has found any of the stuff that he alleges to have found, but yet he won't release any of it. So at any rate, I digress. Here's a quote from Patton. Others believe that the displaced person is a human being, which he is not. And this applies particularly to the Jews who are lower than animals. Oh my goodness. So Patton's concern is that the DP camps, Jews will loot, they will attack, they will be communists, he said. So the concern is, therefore, mail is not allowed to be delivered to or from the camps. Folks don't have the clothing, medicine, food they need. The Jews in the camps are being attacked and beaten by Germans and others. And of course, surviving the concentration camps. You're in no physical condition to fight back. And this is what's happening. Imagine not being able to send mail or receive mail. You survived the Holocaust and you can't find out if your family is alive or what's happening around the world. I mean, just unbelievable. So Truman hears about the conditions in the camps and here's what Patton is doing. So he does a few things. Number one, Truman removes Patton. This takes great courage because Truman's unpopular and Patton is enormously popular. Truman removes Patton. Number two, Truman hires this guy, Earl Harrison, to go to the camps and write a report and figure out what is going on. He wants to use Harrison and Harrison's report to build support in Congress for funding so he can revitalize, he can reform these experiences and send food, medicine, and so on to the DP camps. Who is Earl Harrison? You can see there, this guy looks like he's straight out of Central Casting, doesn't he? He is the dean of the law school at Penn. He's a great man who's very charismatic. He has wide support. So Truman sends Harrison to the DP camps. Harrison reports that, yes, folks lack food, they lack medicine. Jews are being beaten by non-Jews. They can't send mail, they can't receive mail. They're in their striped uniforms. So Truman uses Harrison to walk the halls of Congress, build support, and he sends Harrison back, guess what? With food, clothing, medicine, rabbis, and mail. And one of the other thing Truman does is he orders separate camps. So Jews are in their own DP camps. Every once in a while, you read a sloppy historian who will say, oh, Truman must have been anti-Semitic. He separated Jews from, no, he did it because folks wanted it. Rabbis recommended it, Harrison recommended it, and the folks suffering wanted it so they wouldn't be subject to attacks, have their food stolen, and so on. So here's a line from Harrison's report, which is very troubling. He writes and says, as things stand now, we appear to be treating the Jews as the Nazis treated them, except that we do not exterminate them. They are in concentration camps in large numbers under our military guard instead of SS troops. One is led to wonder whether the German people, seeing this, are not supposing that we are following or at least condoning Nazi policy. Oh my goodness. The other problem for Truman was, as Truman is pushing for reforming the DP camps and pushing for statehood, he's encountering a lot of opposition from the British. Now, Truman realizes that one of the keys for statehood is you need a critical number of Jews on the ground in Transjordan and Palestine. You can't have a state of Israel if there's not enough people there. But the British were not allowing Jews to go to Palestine. British military ships, warships, would intercept barely seaworthy craft filled with Jews trying to flee to Palestine. They would ram them if necessary and then tow them back to places like Cyprus. It's Truman who told the British to cease and desist, to stand down from that policy and allow Jews to make it to Palestine and Transjordan. Truman also stacked the plate here. The British Prime Minister Attlee and the British were proposing no Jews to Palestine. Truman said they're going to Palestine. The question is how many. The British proposed the following. This is farcical. 1,500, that's it. Truman says, okay, 1,500 a month, I order it. The British say that's too many, so Truman says, okay, 100,000. So he reminds the British that he who pays, plays. Truman is funding this and funding Britain, so he's going to let folks go. He also stacks the deck by organizing the Anglo-American Committee and asks them to issue a report. He stacks it with allies, with rabbis, people sympathetic to the cause, and they endorse Truman's recommendation of 100,000 Jews to Palestine. Now, on the eve of statehood, there's a critical situation. There's a famous meeting between Truman and a number of rabbis. And in this meeting, there's some fireworks, everybody. So Truman invites the most famous rabbis in the country to meet with him so that he can talk about statehood. Among them, you can see on the left, Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver from Cleveland, and on the right, Rabbi Stephen Wise from New York. You all know these names? Everybody familiar? Yes? Yeah, okay, good. So Truman invites the rabbis not to debate statehood. He invites them as a courtesy call, telling them that he's lined up the $100 million loan guarantee. He's got General George Marshall on a short leash. Truman has muzzled the British. He's built support. Everything's going to happen May 14th. And he said, I've called you here today because I want you to hear this from my own mouth. I don't want you to read it in a newspaper. I want you to hear it from me. You deserve that. That's incredibly thoughtful from Truman. He says, I want you to go back to your congregations and tell your flock that statehood is going to happen. Now, the problem at the meeting is Rabbi Silver. Silver is a megalomaniac. Silver is also a world-class intellectual and a spellbinding orator. But Silver has the view that Truman should have come to him to tell him rather than him having to go to Truman. Can you imagine the narcissism, the megalomania? Silver then accuses Truman of lying, saying that he doesn't believe him about statehood for Israel. Silver accuses Truman of lying, and he calls him an anti-Semite. Can you imagine? It gets worse, everybody. Silver pounds his fists on Truman's desk while he's yelling at Truman. Truman explodes out of his chair and announces that, quote unquote, no one, and I mean no one, pounds their fists on the table, the desk of the President of the United States. You can get the hell out of my office. He throws Rabbi Silver out of the office. Truman is so angry that he throws all the rabbis out of his office. Silver goes out and makes a bad situation even worse. The media put a microphone in Silver's face, and Silver endorses Dewey and accuses Truman of being a lying anti-Semite. Silver almost undermines the entire statehood package and all the things the US and Truman had put together. He almost undermines it because of his megalomania. Then Silver travels around the country, and he's a fantastic rhetorician, an orator, telling everybody Truman's against us, he's an anti-Semite, don't believe him. My gosh, he almost undermines this. Now, I've had the great pleasure of going to both Silver's temple, his congregation in Cleveland, and Wise's in New York City, and I've lectured from both pulpits, from both bimas. And I remember when I went to Silver's, I even told his congregation, I said, I worry that if I tell this story that the earth is going to open up and swallow me up, or a lightning bolt is going to come down from heaven and blow me off the bima. But I told the story nonetheless. I was happy to tell the story at Wise's synagogue because Wise is the hero of our story. The Zionist community and rabbis around the country were in a panic because Silver told him Truman's not to be believed and he's an anti-Semite. Wise then counters and says, no, I was in the meeting. I believe Truman. Truman's with us. I believed everything he said. So did the other rabbis. The problem isn't Truman. The problem is Silver. Silver was, full of himself and disrespected Truman and pounded on his desk. So Wise says, Truman's with us. He's going to do this for us. But what Wise does is he says, we need to reach Truman to make sure he doesn't change his mind because of Silver. Now, Truman didn't change his mind. He was angry at the rabbis, angry at Silver, but he was still going to recognize Israel and do everything for statehood. But Wise says, I remember hearing that Harry Truman's best friend is a Jew, Eddie Jacobson, his World War I buddy and his haberdashery partner. So Wise says, let's go see Eddie Jacobson and get him to meet with Truman. And what we'll do is we'll ask Truman to meet with the great Dr. Chaim Weizmann. And then Weizmann can talk Truman off the ledge, off the edge, and make sure he doesn't change his mind. Now, again, Truman wasn't going to change his mind, but this was the concern. So Rabbi Wise finds Eddie Jacobson. There's Eddie on the left and Harry on the right at their little haberdashery store. They were World War I buddies. They ran a supply shop during World War I, went into war. And like many men who fought, they both made the deal that if they lived through the war, they will open up their haberdashery. And they lived through it and they opened it up and it failed. And Eddie couldn't pay his debts. Harry covered Eddie's debts. Harry paid back his and Eddie's. Harry was 7 years Eddie's senior. So he was more of like the big brother in this fast friendship. So what happens is Rabbi Wise finds Eddie Jacobson and Eddie goes to see Harry. And Eddie asks Harry to please meet with Dr. Weizmann. The concern was that Harry was going to change his mind. So Eddie wrote down this story and Harry wrote down this story. So they both match, and here's what they said. If you'll note that Eddie is follically challenged, that's important for the context of our story. So Eddie says to Harry, he says, you've got to meet with Dr. Weitzman. He's a great man and an old man, and he's devoted his life to statehood. And now he's in New York City. And then Eddie started crying. He couldn't finish saying it. He was so emotional. Harry had issued, here's the problem. Harry had issued his infamous no more rabbis decree. He was so mad at Silver for trying to undermine all this that Harry said, I'm not meeting with any more rabbis or any more Zionists. He said, I'm going to support statehood. I'm going to do everything for it. I've got the loan guarantee. I just don't want to be criticized anymore. Truman said, I'm getting it from everyone. I'm getting it from the Republicans. I'm getting it from the South. I'm getting it from my wife. I'm getting it from my advisors. I'm getting it from the British. I'm getting it from the State Department. And now the people I'm trying to help are giving it to me also. He said, so I'm not meeting any more rabbis. But because Eddie asked, Harry said, okay, I'll meet with him. And Harry throws his arm around Eddie's shoulder and says, quote unquote, okay, you old bald-headed SOB, I'll meet with him. So Truman agrees to meet with Dr. Weitzman. Let me click ahead here. There we go. And here's a picture of the two of them meeting. So Dr. Weitzman comes to meet with Truman. Now, there's almost a hiccup. There's almost a snafu here. Truman doesn't want the press to know that he's meeting with Weitzman because he said Weitzman will endorse Dewey like Silver did. Weitzman will criticize me and the press will report it, and I'm going to lose as is. I can't deal with that. So he has Weitzman brought in quietly through the back. Weitzman hears all these allegations from Silver that Truman's an anti-Semite. So Weitzman thinks the reason he's brought in through the back door is because he's a Jew. So it's tense. It's an icy cold meeting. And Weitzman's staff starts reading his diplomatic credentials. Dr. Chaim Weitzman, Zionist, chemist, scientist, blah, 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 does hereby present himself to the American president as per the diplomatic protocol. Weitzman sees that Truman is completely disinterested. He's not paying attention. So Weitzman stops the protocol and says, here, I have a gift for you. And he hands Truman the Torah, and you can see him holding it there. He gives Truman the scroll. Now, Truman seals the deal by saying the following. Truman looks at Weitzman, smiles and winks and says, thanks. You know, I think he says, quote unquote, thanks for the thing. He said, you know, I've always wanted one of these. And Weitzman and Truman start laughing. Then in his Missouri drawl, Truman says, look, let's just cut the crap. Let's you and I go in the back room and talk about statehood, for crying out loud. And then in his Missouri drawl, he cannot pronounce C-H-A-I-M, Chaim. Truman says, look, Cham. He calls him Cham. And Weitzman says, Chaim, Chaim. And Truman goes, Chuck, Cham, Chaim, Cham. And they both start laughing. And that's when the photographer took the picture that you're looking at. Isn't that priceless? The two of them go in the back room and they talk about statehood. They come out sometime later, they're arm in arm. Weitzman believes Truman. Weitzman and Truman talked about it. Truman showed his seriousness. Weitzman believes him. That's why the letter I told you earlier, when Weitzman writes to Truman, he says, I told all the staff I knew this would happen because you gave me your word. It's Weitzman who goes out then and meets with Rabbi Silver and says, zip it, enough. Weitzman announces to rabbis, Truman is one of us. He's with us on this. So it was Weitzman who did that. So what a great backstory, huh, everybody? Wouldn't you love to have been there with Truman going, Cham, Cham? Now, what's also fun about this is here we are with statehood, and Weitzman is such a serious person. You know, Truman gets him to laugh. The two of them become good friends. In fact, Weitzman writes Truman a letter. He writes him a bunch of letters, and I've read them. I held them in my hands with white gloves, of course, when I visited the Truman Library and the National Archives. So Weitzman writes Truman a letter, and he teases Truman. He teases him about all the opposition Truman got from Silver and Silver's supporters. So Weitzman says this, I don't know what the population of the US was in 1949. Let's say it's 125 million. I don't know what the population was of Israel. Let's say it's 500,000. Oh, so just for the purposes of the story. So Weizmann writes Truman, and this is what he says in the letter that I read. He says, I don't know if you know this or not, but I'm a much more important leader than you are. He's having it fun. Making jokes. He says, even though you're the leader of 125 million and I'm the leader of only 500,000, I'm the leader of 500,000 people that all think they're the leaders. So this is Weizmann joking, having fun with Truman on it. I think I've told all of you, I recognize a lot of you. 25 years ago, I started a project that I did for many years. I interviewed every single former aide, as I said at the outset of this speech. And I asked a lot of them about these stories. And I asked some of the senior aides, did you ever see Truman cry? I was interviewing 2 aides one time, and the senior one, a man named George Elsey, says to me, yes. And I said, give me an example. He said he once cried when he got a letter from Dr. Weizmann. So I got the letter, and here's what it said. To thank Truman for what he had done, Weizmann writes to Truman and says, generations of Jewish children, yet unborn, will call you Father. Isn't that nice? And Truman was so emotionally vested that he cried. The other thing that Weizmann did was he dispatched the man standing in the back. That's Ambassador Abba Eban. Here's Truman meeting with David Ben Gurion, and Abba Eban. Eban is only 33 years old at this time. And he has the difficult job of being Israel's ambassador to the world, its face, its voice to the world. So Weizmann meets with Eban, and he says, I have an important job for you. Weizmann's writing letters to all the leaders in the world. He dispatches Eban on a diplomatic mission. He said, this is going to be tough. We got to get the world to recognize us and work with us and like us. He says, but there's one meeting that's vitally important, and that's when you go to meet with Truman. He said he's more important than all the other world leaders put together because he's the one who's doing everything for us. And Weizmann says to Abba Eban, this is cute. He says, I want you to remember one thing when you meet with Truman. He said, you're not meeting with Truman, you're meeting with Moses. So he starts calling Truman Moses. So Eban writes that he was, and I read the letter from Eban too. Eban writes that he was so nervous about meeting with Truman, but 2 things happened. One, he tells the story that there was a story of Truman that gave Eban confidence and made him excited to meet with Truman. Here's what it was. On the eve of statehood, the British diplomats, as you all know, were opposing statehood and putting up obstacles. Some diplomats in the US State Department were also opposing statehood and putting up obstacles. So the British and the American diplomats meet with Truman and try to talk him out of it on the eve. Now, the meeting is not scheduled. What they do is they ambush Truman. So the State Department tells Truman, they'd say to Truman, we want you to come in this room to meet with these diplomats. Truman doesn't know the purpose of the meeting. He thinks he's just going to go in and shake some hands, press the flesh, as they say. So it's important for our story because Truman is not, I want you to remember this, he's not briefed, he's not prepped, he doesn't even know why he's walking in. He walks in the meeting to smile and shake hands. The British and the American diplomats team up and try to talk Truman out of statehood. They use a tone something like this. They say in a derogatory manner, you need to remember that you are one of us, not them. We have our priorities, they have their priorities. That's the anti-Semitic condescending tone they're using. After they finish trying to talk Truman out of it, Truman says to them, okay, boys, you've had your turn, now it's mine. And he proceeds to tell them, he ticks off a several thousand-year history of the Hebrew people, filled with names, dates, and events, all of which check out as spot on. Truman has a photographic memory. He was not religious, but he loved the Old Testament, and he loved the sweeping stories of history. He ends by telling everybody, and this is what inspires Abba Eban. Truman says, therefore, I know all about the history of persecution, but I also know about the promise, and I'm here to make it happen. And then he tells them, he says, when I become matured in my course of action, I am immovable. And now you can all get the hell out of my office. And he throws them all out of his office. Truman is so mad at the State Department for trying to sabotage this and set him up on that ambush with the British that he writes a one-sentence memorandum, which he gives to his aides. Now, I apologize to all of you up front, but I'm going to quote it verbatim for the historical accuracy. Truman is so mad at the State Department and so intent on statehood. This is what he says. He has his aides read his memo. His memo says, quote unquote, "Never trust the goddamn sons of bitches in the State Department, Harry S. Truman." He was so mad. So Truman moves ahead with statehood, and Abba Eban goes to meet with Truman, and Eban considers, as Weizmann considered Truman a brother, Eban considers Truman a father figure. When Eban goes to meet with Truman, he's so excited because he hears that story of Truman knowing a multi-thousand-year history. He's going to meet with Moses. Weizmann told Eban that Truman's one of us. So he's excited and nervous to meet with Truman. He wants to do the perfect gesture of thanks and meeting with him. Now, Weizmann, as you all probably know, was a hell of a wordsmith. He had that great accent. He was a world-class intellectual. So Weizmann goes to meet with Truman, and this is how he thanks him. He says to him, "You know, my country is a brand new, small, and poor nation. My people have suffered. Therefore, we cannot present you with titles, knighthoods, gold, jewels and riches, or be-ribboned documents for all we've done. But we can do this." He says, "You need to know that my people, their names will never be forgotten from history. So, to the names Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Noah, and Moses, we add Truman. Mr. President, we thank you and give you immortality." Strategic pause for effect. Wow, right, everybody? Brilliant. Now, he wants to thank Truman. Also, he read that Truman was a fan of Cyrus the Great. And Truman, of course, wanted to be an historian. He was remarkably well read. Cyrus the Great, not Darius, not Xerxes. Those are the crazy Persian kings. Cyrus the Great, 4th, 5th century BCE. He was the first to bring Jews back to Jerusalem, right, everyone? So Eban bows to Truman and calls him. He says this, "For you are the American Cyrus." And Truman says to Eban, "No, it's just Harry." So the two of them developed this wonderful relationship and worked together on statehood. So what explains Truman's extraordinary change of heart? Historians point to a few things. I'd like to tell you them and then add one of my own. So number one on the left, Truman was a Shabbos Goy as a boy. He had a large number of Jewish friends. There he is with Eddie Jacobson. They're going to the opening of a Hallel, which is being named in honor of Eddie. And look at the two of them. Don't they look like kids having fun running to the event? Look at the smiles. You see that, everybody? And Truman's carrying, presumably, what is a certificate, for Eddie, that they're naming it for him. So the two of them are running and laughing, getting along like brothers. Eddie wrote, so Truman, and Truman hired the great Dr. Sam Rosenman, if you know, Judge Sam Rosenman. He was one of Truman's aides. Milton Kale, one of the lawyers that represented Jackie Robinson when he integrated baseball. Truman had a large number of Jewish advisors and a large number of Jewish friends, and his best friend was Eddie. So why the change of heart? Number one, you can't help but see things differently when you have a lot of close friends who are Jewish and they're talking about the plight, the history of persecution, and the Holocaust. Eddie wrote that at the opening of one of these programs, when Eddie and Harry are sitting there and they're thanking Eddie and Harry for what they did for statehood, Eddie said he looked over at Harry and Harry was crying like a baby. So he was emotionally vested in this. Number two, what explains the change of heart? Truman grew up as a racist, anti-Semitic rural farmer in this bigoted family. The Trumans were unreconstructed Confederates. They owned slaves, both sides of the family. Harry married into an even more bigoted family. Bess's mother, Madge, was racist and anti-Semitic. But Truman, one of the things that changed him, number two, was World War I. As I said earlier, there's Captain Harry. He looking really fit, isn't he? Looking about 10 years old. Truman killed men and saw men die. Those of you that know anything about World War I, he was in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, which was an absolute bloodbath and a pivotal battle. And Truman saves the lives of many American men and kills Germans with his artillery unit, comes back a hero, beloved by his men. Truman comes back a changed man in two ways. Number one, he now has confidence. He realizes he can lead men. He realizes he has the stuff of greatness. He faced death and was not afraid. Number two, he realizes the evil that men can do. And Truman vows when he comes back from the war that he's going to devote the rest of his life to being a champion for the downtrodden who needed a champion. If anyone needed a champion, it's the Jewish community during the Holocaust. So there's your logical explanation. And I always tell, when I speak at academic events, and I tell my students that there's two Harry Trumans. There's pre-World War I Harry and after World War I Harry, where he devotes his life to this. Number three, Truman, as I said, was a voracious reader, and he loved the Old Testament. Therefore, as Abba Eban knew, Truman knew all about the persecution. He read the stories. He knew about the promise. I'd like to add one more ingredient to this. We know those three factors influenced Truman's heart, changed his opinion, and made him the great champion of the larger Jewish diaspora and of statehood that we all know. But I'd like to add a fourth one. I think Truman was a man who had a moral compass. I think it was that simple. When FDR would make a decision, FDR made a decision like a chess player. He looked at the game of chess and he was willing, don't misconstrue, but he was willing to sacrifice a pawn to save a bishop or a rook or knight or whatever. FDR was always calculating. He could be a cold, crude, harsh, calculating SOB when he needed to be, or a wonderfully charming person. When Truman had to make a decision, unlike FDR, he did not look at it as a chess game. Truman saw it as a matter of simply, is this the right thing to do? When Truman had to make a decision, he would reach down inside himself and grab a hold of that moral compass and not let go. Doing the right thing was Harry Truman's North Star. I interviewed, as I said several times now, all these Truman aides, and I ended the interviews by asking them about Truman's decision-making style. How could an untraveled, uneducated, failed farmer and rural haberdasher get NATO, the Marshall Plan, the Berlin Airlift, Israel, the expansion of the UN, civil rights? How could he get all these things right? And this is what they told me. Truman would sit all the aides in a room, and he made everybody have skin in the game. He made them tell him their position on the issue. They had to have skin in the game. He sat with the poker face as they all weighed in on it. Then he made them all debate. Truman made them debate and disagree with him. He knew that debate, dissent, and disagreement were critical ingredients for a healthy democracy. In fact, the aides said Truman not only, think of Nixon and Lyndon Johnson. They were so thin-skinned, and they were both masterful politicians. But Nixon and LBJ were so thin-skinned that they would fire you if you disagreed with them. They were so thin-skinned that they mixed up the messenger with the message and got rid of you even if you had bad news. Carter thought he knew more than everybody, so he didn't invite disagreement. Donald Trump fired everybody if you didn't think he was God, right? He fired everybody for no reason. George W. Bush surrounded himself with sycophants. He didn't want to hear anything but his own view. And again, Carter thought he knew more than everybody. Harry Truman, the aides told me, he not only welcomed debate, he would tell his aides, you not only have permission to disagree with me, that's an order from your commander. So he had a fundamental moral compass. I'd like to close by just saying, Truman was the first world leader to recognize Israel. He floated a $100 million loan guarantee. Without that money, it would be a different history. Truman was the first to create trade agreements with Israel. Remember, everybody, in 1948 and 49, the world would not sell to nor buy from. Truman gave Israel a predecessor of what today we know as the most favored nation clause, prioritizing trade with Israel to help their economy. Truman created the immigration exchanges that we have to today. He created the cultural exchanges. There's always Israeli orchestras or scholars or museum exhibits traveling through the US. Students go back and forth. Truman created the joint military training that we see today. Truman created the joint intelligence sharing, the joint commercial development, and all this would produce what? The Iron Dome in recent years, funded by Obama and the Congress back then. This created David's sling, the Arrow, Israel's long-term anti-intercontinental ballistic missile system. Truman was the first to veto anti-Israel measures in the United Nations. Truman protected Israel copyrights, patents, and trademarks in the international market, which we still do, all presidents since then. It was Truman, Truman, Truman. And I'll end with this. When Truman left office on January 20th, 1953, he was enormously unpopular. In the history of public opinion approval polls, the first poll was taken by George Gallup in 1933. In the history of public opinion polling, guess which president was the lowest? Not Trump, not Carter, not W, not Nixon on the eve of Watergate. And God, we've had some bad presidents. It was Harry Truman, 22%. 22%. When Truman was leaving office, he carried his own suitcase, everyone. No crowds, no farewell. Eisenhower refused to get out of the limo and go in to meet Harry and Bess for a tour of the White House and scones. He stiffed Truman. That's only happened 3 times in history. John Adams snuck out of the Capitol under cover of darkness the night before the inauguration in 1801. He was mad at Jefferson. Eisenhower didn't come in to see Truman. And of course, Trump became the first president to not have a civil handoff of power by claiming it was a fraud and it wasn't real and he's still the president and lying and bad mouthing everyone. So it's only happened 3 times: John Adams, Trump, and Ike. And it disappoints me because Ike should have known better. And I'm a fan of Ike's and I'm a fan of John Adams's. But so Truman leaves carrying his own suitcase. He's walking and the polling has him at 22%. A major newspaper claimed that Truman was the worst president of the 20th century. Mind you, Coolidge, Harding, and Hoover were in the 20th century. And Truman's aides, as they told me the story, were trying to cheer him up. They're saying things like this: Mr. President, because of the Marshall Plan, you saved Europe. Mr. President, the Berlin airlift prevented World War III. You have pushed civil rights, women's issues. Mr. President, you fed hundreds of thousands of people around the world. You've clothed them after the war. And then they said this: Mr. President, thousands of Jews are alive now because of you, because of your immigration program. You got them out of the camps and the DP camps. And Truman says to the aides, how many did we get? And they said, you brought in over 390,000 Jews from DP camps. And Truman says, that's not enough. I could have done more. No, he couldn't. No, he couldn't. There's almost 400,000 people. This is extraordinary because the Congress and the country wanted 0. Moreover, here's the problem. We have immigration quotas. And if Jews are in DP camps and they don't want to go back to Russia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Germany, and I wouldn't go back. If they don't want to go back, they're now stateless. So if you don't have a state, how do you get in under an immigration quota? There were numbers for Germany, numbers for Austria, numbers for Czechoslovakia, but folks couldn't get in, so they were stateless, they were stuck. So here's what Truman does. He tells his aides to find out how many folks Greece has on its immigration quota and how many Greeks came in. Let's say Greece had 10,000 spots, but only 5,000 Greeks came in. Truman authorized his aides, he told them, I hear there's 5,000 Jewish Greeks. List the Jews as Greek and bring 5,000 in. He was fudging the numbers. violating our immigration numbers. One senior aide told me that Truman could have been impeached for this, but this is his commitment. So the aide said when Truman found out, that was the one thing he really felt strongly about, was saving folks from the DP camps. So everybody, that's the behind the scenes story of statehood in 1948 and Harry Truman's momentous and vital support for it. And if it had not happened, history would be fundamentally different. I can't think Dewey wouldn't have done this. Heck, FDR would not have done this. I don't know that Ike would have done it to this level. So there's the story. Thank you, everyone. Questions and comments? Thank you, Jack. Appreciate it. Thank you, Roberta. Okay. Questions, comments, and are we going to have these curated or moderated, or do you just want to unmute and yell at me, or raise your hand or unmute, or I have no preference. What do you want to, is it Amanda who's helping us now? What do you want to do?
Whichever way you want to do. So people can unmute if that's easiest.
Unmute, have at me. While you're waiting, I'll say that, this legacy is extraordinary when you consider Truman's upbringing. And I think all of us, I use this as a lesson. I reflect on this. This is one of my favorite stories, by the way, and you all know I have thousands of history stories. As everybody that's known me has heard, my friends, it's funny if we go out to dinner and I start, they go, no, don't start. My own kids are like, it's funny. We go out to dinner sometimes and someone will walk up to us and say, Dr. Watson, and they'll ask me a question about Truman and my kids will go, no, don't ask him. Don't get started. Because we've heard this our whole lives. At any rate, here's my point. We all think that you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Truman is proof that you can. His maturation, indeed his love and commitment, his willingness to risk his presidency for statehood is absolutely extraordinary. And I think this is one of those lessons that we need to tell ourselves. Today, there's so much bad news. The world has gone mad. There's 1,000 crises in the US. I don't know who would want to be the president or a politician. Nothing can be done. The whole world, every day, there's a dozen new hotspots. Anti-Semitic violence has been on the rise for about 5 or 6 years. It's returned. We'll talk about that at the next lecture. When I get depressed and pessimistic, I think of this story because it shows you that one man can make such a difference. And look at what Truman did, to the point where, as I said, Eben and Weizmann always call Truman Cyrus or Moses after this. I mean, just an extraordinary legacy. And it all came from an uneducated, failed farmer from rural Missouri who was raised in an anti-Semitic and racist house. What a story. So again, if never again and never forget have resonance, we need to keep reminding ourselves of these stories. So, okay, who has a question? I've been filibustering if you haven't noticed. Everybody good? Let me just check the chat room. No questions. Okay, I'll close it then by just reminding you what I always remind everybody. I'm cruising again. I want to invite you to 2 things. First off, this winter, we have a distinguished lecture series at Lynn University. I'm bringing it back. I've run it for 20 years at FAU and Lynn. We've had presidents and generals and all sorts of folks. In January, I have an Academy Award-winning filmmaker from Hollywood who's a board member of the Holocaust Museum. In February, I have a Pulitzer Prize winner who's the nation's leading scholar on the founders and revolution. In March, I have a Presidential Medal of Freedom winner who's the nation's leading scholar on Abraham Lincoln. They're all coming into Lynn. It's open to the public. All you have to do is call Lynn University and ask for the events office and just say, hey, Dr. Watson invited us. And they can help you get tickets for these programs. The other thing, I want to invite you to join me on a cruise in June. We have a Jewish heritage. We have a lot of cruises, but here's 2. In June, we have a Jewish heritage cruise on the Danube, Prague, Budapest, Vienna. We have on Uniworld, which is a marvelous line, great food, great tours. They're allowing me to curate and customize the tours. I'm working with them. We've created a dozen Jewish heritage tours, intriguing and important sites. We're going to go to Sigmund Freud's home in Vienna, Theresian concentration camp in Prague, the Great Doheny Street synagogue, the largest in Europe, in Budapest. We're going to visit it. We have a dozen Jewish heritage tours, fantastic tours. Then we have a dozen non-Jewish heritage, foodie tours, vineyards, museums, gelato, anything you want. So I've got all that built in. I'll lecture every day on the history of everywhere we're going, and we have all these fun tours. Secondly, in 2023, it's the 75th anniversary of statehood, apropos to our lecture here. So I'm going to go. If you want, in June of 2023, we're taking Oceana, and we're sailing to both Ashdod and Haifa. By being in both large Israeli ports, we can easily then visit Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, the Golan. And I've put together about 6 tours. I'm working with Oceana. We don't have them locked yet. We have plenty of time. Over the next year and a half, we'll lock down several great tours for everybody. I'll lecture every day on the history of where we're going. And just the icing on the cake, on the way to Israel, we're going to do we have a couple stops. We're stopping at Santorini, Mykonos, and Rhodes. On the way back, we're stopping at Sicily, the Amalfi Coast. Yeah. So there you go. So all you got to do is email me, rwatson@lynn.edu, rwatson@lynn.edu, or call Lynn and say, what's Dr. Watson's email? All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving. And I'll see everybody in 2 weeks for the 4th and final lecture in our series. Okay. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.